to think about anything right now. Tomorrow, the paperwork all is at the consulate. So it's a big day and we're still dealing with the poor kitty and it's just been crazy. Think about anything right now. Tomorrow, the paperwork all is at the consulate. So there's just a lot. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not sure which end is up sometimes right now.
Them get a good bottle of wine.
Are they?
Oh, trust me. As soon as this class is over, I probably will be sitting down with a little sip of bourbon on ice, you know.
Tim, are they requiring proof of your vaccinations?
Good question. It changes. We have to stay abreast of whatever the current changes are. Right. We just found out today that Portugal is probably going to reopen to US tourists in the next couple of days, and Portugal will require proof of vaccination to get into the country. That nothing's finalized, but we just actually found that out today. Now, what each airline, we're flying Lufthansa. Out of Savannah, Lufthansa Savannah to Newark, and then Lufthansa Newark directly into Lisbon.
Well, that's interesting. Lufthansa stops at Savannah?
Apparently.
I didn't think so, Tim.
Yep, so what we have our tickets already.
You might have
they fly a lot of places you wouldn't think. They really do. I don't know why.
Yeah, so anyway, that's what we have. We have Lufthansa out of Savannah to Newark, Newark to Lisbon. That's what we've got. But we are also very well aware that with the way travel is right now, things can change. We have known people we have a friend who had to fly from Columbus, Ohio to Dallas, and in the space of 2 weeks, his flight changed 4 times.
Wow.
So, you know, you just got to be ready for that. It's just the way it is right now. So, you know, we are scheduled to leave. Our flight is scheduled to leave July 27th. So, and we will fly overnight and be in Lisbon in Portugal on the morning of the 28th.
If we're all there with a band, would you be embarrassed?
Oh, that would be fun.
Okay, we'll organize here.
Hey, that would be fun. I'm good with that. You know, it's hard for me. It's not sinking into me yet that I'm going to actually be 100% retired. So I'm not really even sure how that's going to go over. You know, there's so much right now. There's so much to do that it doesn't really feel retired. So,
is your Portuguese good enough?
Before? Where did you teach before? Where did you teach before?
I was a high school English teacher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought so, but I haven't, gotten to talk to you very much.
Right.
I wish I had gotten in your class sooner.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you were able to make the ones here.
Yeah, I feel sad.
I'm sad and I'm happy. I've got so many different emotions going on. It's just crazy, you know.
But the bourbon helps, right?
Oh yeah, a little sip of bourbon is always a help.
Helps everything.
Because our neighborhood, you know, we have a very, very close neighborhood. So next Sunday, all the neighbors are giving us a kind of send off, going away, whatever you want to call it. So we've got that too. And
everybody a lot of people are on already.
A lot of people might not let you go, Tim, so understand. They're happy for you, but unhappy for us.
You know.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you know, there's always the possibility that the Portuguese consulate might say, nope, sorry, you can't go. We're not giving you a visa.
And of course, you could just continue working by Zoom. You know,
so if we were doing a 6:30 class for Mickve, Israel, and Savannah, I would be teaching in Porto at 11:30 p.m. because it's a 5-hour time differential between Portugal and the East Coast of the United States. So,
Well, as a senior, you'll learn to take naps, and then you can, anytime,
Right.
2 in the morning.
right. Well, back in the old days, well, not the old days, but when I was younger and we wanted to go out and stay out all night, we used to call those disco naps.
Right. Okay.
So you could go out and dance, go to the disco and dance all night without getting too tired. Now, my disco nap might allow me to stay all the way till 10 o'clock at night. Such, me, big party animal. It's 10 o'clock, I'm tired.
I don't even get it. Whole thing.
So
What's the difference time-wise there, Tim?
5 hours. It's a 5-hour time differential. Yeah.
When are you leaving?
Yes.
The 27th is the date that we're actually flying out of the United States. 27th of July. 27th of July.
And
So-
what did you do with all your house belongings?
With our what?
Your furniture?
Furniture has all been sold. Luckily, much of it sold to people we know, so they're letting us keep it until we're ready to go. So we still have it in our house. And then the last week, they'll come and get everything. Literally, there's nothing in the house that has not been sold.
I thought you
Wow.
said at the Zoom meeting here, that's why.
So, and the house itself is sold. We are merely renting back from the new
Oh, that was
owners. until we
transferred,
leave.
right?
Oh. Buying a rent back.
That works well.
Yeah, we were able to negotiate everything to everybody, so it worked out for everybody. I mean, it's what it is, I never realized all the little things to think about when you're leaving, because we are going to have to do a whole new cell phone service kind of thing in Portugal, all of that. So we'll keep our US cell phone for a while, then eventually switch it over to Portuguese service, which is a lot cheaper than the US, let me tell you. Let's see what else. It's just, there's just a lot of the little things, and of course they have a different electrical plug system. So nothing that you plug in without an adapter can you take with you.
Yeah.
And they don't recommend keeping things on adapters for a long period of time. So we're taking a couple of lamps with us that we really like that are kind of antique kind of lamps, but we found out that there are places there that will rewire them to proper specifications for electricity in Portugal. The nice thing is we are Apple computer people, always have been. I was a teacher, so Apple was very big in education. Apple computers are designed to run on both European and American systems. So that's
Tim, one little thing you might not have thought of, there's this different language. Did anybody tell you about that?
Yes, there is that. And we are actually doing some work with some of the basic terminology in Portugal, just things to get along. 97% of the Portuguese speak English, which is very interesting. And what they will do is you'll start talking to them in Portuguese, and to put you out of your misery, they'll switch you to English. But I want to learn it. We are bound and determined to learn at least enough. Will we ever be fluent? Probably not. But we want to learn enough that I just think it's the respectful thing to do, is to know enough of their language. Yes, question, Chris. Yes.
Do you already speak one of the Romance languages?
I know a little bit of Spanish. I know a little bit of French. I know German. You know what? The one thing I'm good at is picking up languages.
A piece of cake.
So I will probably do okay with that. Caleb, not so much, but he's a little more challenging with the language thing. But you know what? Everybody says that once you're there for a while, you just pick it up, especially the kind of phrases you need to be able to order in a restaurant, to, ask questions at the grocery store. But as I said, it's interesting. 97% of the Portuguese speak English. So
Is banking a problem?
no, we already have a bank account in Portugal, which is, we already have funding. We already have funded bank account in Portugal. The difference between US banking and European banking is European banking gives you nothing for free. Nothing. Everything costs you something. But, you know, it's a trade-off for the fact that other things are much more affordable. So, you know, it's a whole new thing. But yeah, we've already got a European bank account. We already have our NIF numbers, which is kind of like a social security number, but not really, because it's not hooked into like really secretive stuff. You can yell your NIF number across the grocery store to somebody and it's not going to give them any like insight into your, you know, personal stuff. So
But healthcare,
healthcare is a nationalized healthcare, which you qualify. The minute we get our residency card, we qualify for national healthcare.
you're going to become a resident then? I don't understand.
A D7 visa allows you to become a resident of Portugal, not a citizen, a resident. You have residency, and anybody who has residency is allowed to be on the national healthcare system.
Wow. Do you pay taxes then, or do you pay into the healthcare
Well,
system?
they have, for 10 years, pretty much, they have reciprocity with the United States. If we pay United States tax, we don't have to pay Portuguese tax.
Wow.
Oh,
Mm.
And the healthcare, as I said, is like a minimal. I think for two of us, the only kind of out-of-pocket expense we would have per month would equal about $60, $70.
Wow.
And there's no deductibles. When you go to the doctor and all that, there's no deductibles here like they have in the United States. It's covered
Yeah.
right from the get-go.
You have a house or an apartment?
We have rented an apartment. We have a lease already. It's a furnished apartment because we knew we would need that for the first year. It'll give us a chance to decide where we want to sort of maybe buy a condo or something once we get there, but we have a year to kind of figure that out.
Well,
We do have a lease. They will not let you into the country unless you have a lease.
You're looking at this as more than a year's hiatus.
Oh, yes, definitely. No, we pretty much think this is where we're going to be.
Really, this is
Yeah.
the remainder of your time will be spent.
Yes.
I see. Wow. Okay.
And we just found out that Porto train station has a direct train to Madrid and a direct train to Paris. So those will be two of the first trips we're taking. We'll take a trip to Madrid, we'll take a trip to Paris. I've always wanted to see the Prado, so this will be my chance to do that.
It's not in Paris, you know.
No, it's in Madrid.
I just want to make sure you knew where it was. Okay.
But the Prado means more to me than the Louvre. I mean, I know the Louvre is in Paris, but I have much more desire to see the Prado than the Louvre. I don't know why, I just do. So, well, we should get started on our actual class here since it is 6:38 or so. So I'm going to mute everybody. Feel free to pipe in with unmuting yourself and questions. So this is going to tell us a little bit about the history of the synagogue and some interesting synagogue facts that maybe you don't know. You know, I learned some interesting little things as I was actually putting this class together. Of course, most of you probably know that the word synagogue itself is not a Hebrew word. It is actually a word that is from the Greek language. So when we say the word synagogue, we are going back to Greek, and it is from a Greek word that means assembly. So it's a fitting word because certainly the synagogue is a place that we as people do assemble. We assemble for worship and for prayer. We assemble also in the synagogue for all sorts of other things, for learning, for socialization, for dinners, for mitzvahs, for celebrations, etc., simchas. So the idea of the word synagogue, meaning a place of assembly, certainly seems to be very, very fitting. Now, a lot of people think that the synagogue did not come into being until after the temple era, until after the temple was destroyed, which is, I'll be honest with you, is kind of what I thought as well. But in researching the whole history of the synagogue is, while the temple truly was the primary focus of Jewish prayer and Jewish worship, and the whole sacrificial element of the temple carried out by the high priests, the Kohanim, they would carry out the very, very detailed specifics of the various sacrifices that are all detailed very, very well in the Torah. They would do those in the names of the people. And the people who were there for those sacrifices and for that worship at the temple were really bystanders. It was not a participatory kind of prayer. It was not a participatory kind of worship. The Kohanim and the high priests, they did the work while the people just were witnesses. However, there were many people who could not get to the temple. It was merely impossible because of distance, because perhaps of financial situations, because of work situations. There were people who simply, it was not feasible for them to get to the temple on the various holidays and festivals and such. So there were synagogues during the temple era. During the period of temple Judaism, we already had the idea of a synagogue, a place of assembly. The earliest that we know from archaeology, what we know that the earliest synagogue structure that has been actually determined to be a synagogue was found in Egypt, and it dates from the 3rd century BCE. So we're going back quite a ways for this earliest record of synagogue. And again, this was in Egypt. Now, beyond that, since that point in that record of this first synagogue in Egypt, they have unearthed, archaeologists have unearthed more than a dozen other synagogues that date back to the temple era, to temple Judaism. Many of them were in Israel. If you will recall, when we had the program after Shabbat services, where Yoram, who had been our tour guide in Israel, he showed us a synagogue that was ancient in Modi'in, Israel. When we were in Israel with the Mickve Israel trip 2 summers ago, we saw the remnants of a synagogue that was actually part of the whole Masada, what was a synagogue. So there were synagogues in what we consider present day Israel, and there were other synagogues also in the Hellenistic world, the world of the Greeks. So the synagogue did exist in conjunction or at the same time as the temple. Now, what we know of those early synagogues is they don't look, of course, like our synagogues today. You see these synagogues, they were quite simple. Most of them were stone structures, hewn out of stone, as you can probably imagine. They consisted of benches. I guess sitting on stone is not particularly comfortable, but it is what it is. And these stone benches that would have been carved out of the natural stone would surround a platform. In addition to the platform, there was often a courtyard that was a part of these early synagogues. And some of them, from what we can tell, and this was true of the one in Masada that we visited, also had a mikveh close by. So you had the benches, you had a platform, and you had, in many cases, a nearby mikveh to these very, very ancient synagogues. And these were communal places of gathering, so hence the word synagogue, assembly. These were places for the community of Jews to gather. Now, when they would gather, what was happening in these synagogues? We know today that if we go to Friday night synagogue service or Saturday morning Shabbat service, we have a liturgy, we have a prayer book, we know that there is a certain order. So what was happening in these very early synagogues? Well, interestingly enough, from what we know, historians, archaeologists say there were already, at that point, some fixed prayers that were a part of going to the synagogue. And some of those fixed prayers, just like we have fixed prayers in our Friday night and our Saturday liturgy, some of the prayers that they believe were already a part of the earliest synagogue services during Temple Judaism is the Baruch Hu. So there is evidence that the Baruch Hu, which we call, kind of the call to worship. The Baruch Hu is technically really the beginning of the worship service. Everything that precedes the Baruch Hu is kind of getting us ready or preparing us in the mindset of prayer and the mindset of worship. They believe that there was some element of a Kedusha. So the Kedusha, holy, 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 that we recite in a longer form on Saturday, a much shorter form on Friday night. was already beginning to be a fixed prayer in these early synagogues. And of course, a prayer that, magnifies the holiness of God. And they also believed that there was some element of the Shemona Esrei. Now, the Shemona Esrei is probably not maybe familiar to some people. The Shemona Esrei would be what we would call the weekday Amidah, the standing prayer, which consists of 18, but really 19 blessings that are recited as part of weekday services in the morning. They believed that there was also some element of the Shemona Esrei. So these prayers that would continue through the thousands of years and even up to our present day Judaism were already being recited communally in these very, very early synagogues. So there was already some sort of early form of liturgy that was being recited, that was being performed. What about Torah reading, and what about preaching, etc.? It is believed that someone in the community, not necessarily someone called a rabbi at this point, but someone who had knowledge, would offer some kind of, today we would think of as a sermon or some kind of lesson. And there was actually some element of Torah reading in these very early synagogues. So as much as these early synagogues that existed during Temple Judaism period were very different from our synagogue, in some ways we are already seeing what will come to be Jewish worship beginning to take shape, beginning to take form way, way back for these people who could not get to Jerusalem, who could not get to the temple during the holidays, during the festival days, etc. So it's very fascinating to think that there were people these thousands of years ago who were already citing some version of prayers that we are still saying today when we go to Shabbat services. I mean, that's a pretty strong connection when you really stop to think about, that kind of connection to people thousands of years ago. Of course, as Jewish history moves forward, as Jewish history moves on, we have the destruction of the Second Temple after the Second Temple was rebuilt. And that is when really the synagogue becomes the central focus of Jewish communal prayer. With the idea, of course, that at some point, there will be another temple, there will be a rebuilding of the temple, but for the time being, until that happens, there would be the synagogue, and that would become the focus of Jewish prayer. Beyond that, it would also become the focus of Jewish learning. It would become a communal center. We now have JCCs, like here we have the JEA, community centers that move beyond just the element of prayer. But early synagogues, of course, would also be a place for Jews in any particular community to gather together, to have a place to share thoughts and ideas. And of course, there would be no more sacrifices. Judaism would switch from the idea of the sacrifices detailed in the Torah, and prayer would replace the sacrifices. So what we now recite as liturgy, the prayers we now recite when we go to synagogue, when we go to services, all of that replaces what were once the temple sacrifices. Now, if you think about it, this makes a great deal of sense, because as Jews began to move out of the area that is today present-day Israel and out of Jerusalem, go into diaspora, prayer is very portable. Prayer is a very portable thing. You can take your prayers with you very, very easily. It did not require a fixed structure like a temple with a fixed structure of an altar that would be necessary to carry out what were the sacrifices as detailed in the Torah. So the idea of moving into diaspora, taking prayer with you, prayer is a very portable thing. Throughout Jewish history, Jews have learned that what is portable, what can be easily carried with you, such as knowledge, the idea of Jews as the people of the book, that knowledge can go with you. it's up in your head. It's part of you, and it's not something that has to stay where it is. So the idea that prayer is a portable thing, it can go with you wherever your community decides to settle down, and you will still have that element of prayer. And you don't need the temple, and the whole sacrificial element would fall by the wayside. As I said, though, prayers that are still very much a part of the Orthodox liturgy that will pray for at some point the rebuilding of the temple. In Reform Judaism, we pretty much sort of put that aside. Yes, Maury.
I'm guessing that this is something that's probably unknown unless there are writings that address it. I'm kind of assuming after the destruction of the Second Temple, it was sort of universally decided, well, we don't have a temple, so we can't have sacrifices. Or is there anything suggesting that there were attempts to continue, the priestly function and continue sacrifices, even though there wasn't a temple?
There may have been. In looking at the background that I did for putting this class together, I did not see any element of trying to carry the sacrifices beyond the temple, that was something that was pretty much tied directly to the temple. It may have happened, and we don't know. It may have been attempted in places to continue the tradition of the sacrifices as detailed in the Torah. But it was pretty much decided, or seemed to be pretty much decided, that we would now have prayer as a way of letting God know that we have not forgotten God, that we are worshiping God, we are remembering God when we celebrate the holidays and the festivals, rather than the various sacrifices. Be an interesting thing that at some point maybe they would find, that there was some attempt to keep the sacrificial element going, but I did not discover any definite, idea that had occurred. So, who knows? I mean, we find out new things all the time, and maybe at some point something will be discovered that there was an attempt to keep the whole element of the sacrifice going. So it's an interesting question. It's a great question. So as Judaism became what we would eventually call rabbinic Judaism, as opposed to temple Judaism, clearly there had to be some changes. And this is where the synagogue would become the central focus of the Jewish community. Now, what's interesting is, unlike Roman Catholic churches and Roman Catholic cathedrals, because of course Roman Catholicism would become the predominant element of Christianity at that time, there was really no sort of blueprint for what a synagogue architecturally needed to be. So while we know that many of the great churches and cathedrals of Roman Catholicism in Europe and beyond have this very cruciform sort of setup to represent the cross or the crucifix or whatever, that did not occur in terms of Judaism. There was no sort of sitting down for somebody to say, well, this is exactly what a synagogue needs to be, or how it needs to be built, or how it needs to be set up architecturally. So we don't really have a blueprint design for the synagogue. So what would usually seem to happen as the synagogue became the focus is that local custom, wherever there was a Jewish community, the local custom and the local style would sort of determine what kind of structure was being designed and what sort of structure was being built, rather than something that was kind of uniform. So if you went around, well, a synagogue in one community would look very much like a synagogue in a different or another community. There was not that sort of uniform element. So each community would determine, based on local custom, this is how we're going to build our synagogue, and this is how we're going to design our synagogue. It was known that there was an attempt early on, this is early on in the building of synagogues, that elements of archways, some elements of sort of domed structures, some sort of tower as part of the synagogue was added. And this was an influence of other religions on Judaism. As Jews in communities looked around at other places of worship, they saw these elements of architecture being added to houses of worship and thought, well, perhaps we should add them to our houses of worship as well. So old synagogues, unfortunately, many of which do not survive, did sort of copy what was being done in other houses of worship in community. So they looked around at the Christian community or other communities that had houses of worship and tried to sort of copy or mimic, if you will, what was happening, which of course would make sense. If this seemed to be adequate for praising God or for prayer, then perhaps we need to do the same thing. We know that the earliest synagogues that were built in these communities in diaspora, though, tended to stay, rather than grandiose and rather than big and rather than magnificent, where people would stand in awe of these structures or stand in awe of these buildings, tended to be a little bit more on the low key and a little bit more on these sort of subtle architectural elements, primarily because of the fear of anti-Semitism. Jewish communities in diaspora did not want to be too showy. They did not want to be too obviously Jewish. We know that looking at some of them on the outward sides, you can see no sort of Jewish symbolism of any kind. And that was done primarily to be able to live in peace and live in harmony with their Gentile neighbors, not to cause any sort of anger or any sort of undue anti-Semitism from the local community that was predominantly Christian. So keep them a little bit more subtle, keep them a little bit more low key. We'll add some little elements to it to make it stand out perhaps from a traditional house or a traditional building, but we really don't want to cause any kind of trouble for the local Jewish community. And of course, this is something that Jews have dealt with, for many, many years. Let's try to live in harmony and not bring too much attention because we don't need that added stress of some kind of anti-Semitism. Well, eventually, as history goes on, and history goes on for a long time, we know, if you'll remember, that there was a period in European history that was known as the Enlightenment. And during this period of Enlightenment, when monarchies began to fall apart and some of the old ways of thinking began to fall aside, science was given far more due than necessarily religion in some cases. The period of Enlightenment brought a great deal of emancipation to the Jewish community. In different countries, at some point, Jews were finally going to be allowed to have some element of freedom of worship. They were going to have some element of being able to join different professions, to be able to mingle more freely with their non-Jewish neighbors and to be a part of society. They were in places where Jews were forced to live in ghettoized communities, behind walls, closely watched, closely guarded. As life became better and freedom came to the Jewish communities, now is when we would see that Jewish communities would begin to want their houses of worship. These congregations would want their houses of worship to rival some of the grand cathedrals and some of the grand churches of Christianity that dotted many of the cities and communities of Europe. Now that Jews were going to have their freedom and we're going to have the emancipation from the ghetto, let's build houses of worship that will look just as beautiful, just as grand, where people will stand in awe of architecture just as much as they do at some of the grand cathedrals in the Catholic Church. But here again, even though now we would start to see the building of these very, very beautiful synagogues throughout the Jewish world, it was still a very eclectic style. There was not necessarily one particular architectural style that would dominate the building of synagogues. It would still be very much whatever was popular locally at the time, which is why if you look at various pictures of synagogues, you see a lot of different styles. There are synagogues, as you may know, that look very, very much like a mosque and have elements of the Moorish sort of background to them. And then others that look very, very much like churches. And I mean, look at Mickve, Israel. Okay, we're talking late 1800s. And here we have our beautiful Mickve, Israel, that certainly looks very churchy. I mean, let's just be honest. It's a very churchy looking building. As I told you, we get phone calls all the time, you know, when people were coming for tours and they'd say, we can't find you. We can't find you. Where are you? And we would say, well, where are you? Well, we're standing on Monterey Square. Okay, what are you looking at? Well, we see the Johnny Mercer house. Well, like directly across the square is Mickve Israel. That's the synagogue. And the comment we would get all the time is, oh, we thought that was a church. Well, you know, look above the front door and you see the Star of David, of course. But the synagogues, I mean, Jews wanted their houses of worship to be as beautiful and as magnificent as many of the cathedrals and many of the churches. So this is when we would have the grand sort of European cathedrals, sadly, some of which would not survive the Nazis and World War II, but some would, luckily. We'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. So as synagogues were being built, even though there was not one architectural blueprint for the synagogue, there were certain things that were now becoming required in the building of a synagogue. Most of these you probably can guess. Of course, there had to be a bima. There had to be a bima. There had to be a place, a raised area for the reading of the Torah, for rabbinical preaching on some lesson or sermon from the Torah. But traditionally in Orthodox synagogues, the bima, or the raised platform for the reading of the Torah, was in the middle of the synagogue. It was not set to the front like we are very used to, as we see in Mickve Israel, but the raised platform where the actual reading of the Torah would be conducted was in the center. And the congregants who would be there for service, who would be there for worship, would sort of sit around the Torah, around the platform where the Torah would be read. But there was some element of a bima. It would be Reform Judaism when it would start to become more popular, as I said, starting in Germany, where the bima would be moved to the front of the synagogue. But traditionally, you had a bima in the middle. There, of course, had to be a place for the Torah to be stored. And that would be the Ark or the Aron Kodesh, where the Torah scrolls would be housed when they were not being used in service. And of course, that would be on the east wall. Interestingly enough, even in these very, very old ancient synagogues in the temple era, the east wall was always where, if there was a Torah, they called it a Torah shrine back then. They didn't call it an ark, they didn't call it an Aron Kodesh, but always the idea of wherever the Torah was, it would be on the east wall. So it would always have some relationship to Jerusalem. So you would have this ark, or you would have this Aron Kodesh on the east wall. That is where the Torah scrolls would be stored when they were not being used in service. There would additionally be what was called somewhere a reader's table and a lectern, where preaching could be done. And of course, tables had to be large enough for the unrolling of the Torah. I mean, you can't have a little, sort of nice square little table because the Torah won't fit. So you had to make sure that these were oftentimes beautifully carved wooden tables where to honor the Torah and to honor the presence of God in the sanctuary, where the Torah could be easily unrolled and read from. We would also have the Ner Tamid. Of course, the Ner Tamid is the eternal light, the burning light. Initially, these were oil lamps. Now, of course, they are electric. Doesn't seem to be particularly safe to have oil lamps necessarily burning constantly in the synagogue. So we have them electric. And they are always placed in sort of the vicinity of the ark, so that you would have the Ner Tamid in very close proximity to the ark where the Torah scrolls would be kept. And of course, the Ner Tamid is meant to sort of symbolize the eternal presence of God always present in the sanctuary of the synagogue. Interior decorations of the synagogue, of course, could vary. Could be scenes from stories of the Torah. You could have scenes from Noah's Ark, etc. But clearly in Judaism, we have no depiction of the human form. We certainly have no depiction of God. We do not put statues as a way to decorate our synagogues or our sanctuaries, but certainly other symbolism from Judaism was more than adequate to give our sanctuaries, to give our synagogues some sort of decoration. So you could see representations of the ark. You could see representations of various animals that are mentioned in the Torah. Of course, the Star of David would become a common symbol that would be used as well. Now, seating in the synagogue, initially, there were no fixed seats or no fixed, as we might call them, pews in the synagogue. In the earliest synagogues, and I try to think about this sometimes, the earliest worshipers would actually either sit on the floor, and of course, these were not necessarily the most comfortable, or they would bring mats to sit on. So if you wanted something beyond sitting on the floor, you could bring a mat and you could sit on a mat as opposed to sitting on the bare floor. Benches, pews, seating as we know it today in the synagogue was introduced in Europe, and that again would become much more common in the 1800s, where fixed seating and fixed pews, if you will, would become a feature of the synagogue. Today, and I don't think this is ever going to happen at Mickve, Israel, today most modern synagogues prefer seating that is movable and portable. Rather than fixed pews, which we are used to at Mickve, Israel, a lot of synagogues have taken out fixed pews, fixed seating for things that can be configured into different shapes, different forms, or where seating can completely be removed if necessary for some function that is going on. That seems to be where modern synagogue seating is going. I know that in Ohio, the synagogue we belong to, the seats could be moved and added to and put in a circle, or they could be more squared off if they wanted to. I don't see a historic building like Mickve, Israel kind of going in that direction, but who knows what might happen in the future. But just think, once upon a time, you would have come to the synagogue and you would have been sitting on the floor. As I get a little bit older, the idea of getting down on the floor and getting up from the floor seems to be a little bit more challenging. But I guess you do what you have to do. Now, one other thing to mention is that, of course, in Orthodox synagogues, this is not, of course, a feature of Mickve, Israel, there would also have to be a mechitza. A mechitza. The mechitza is the partition that would separate the men's seating from the women's seating. Because in Orthodox synagogues, you did not have men and women sitting together. So there would be some form of partition, known as a mechitza, that would separate the women's area from the men's area. Or if there was not a mechitza, the women would sit in the balcony. There would be a balcony area, a raised area that would be around the perimeter, the back perimeter, and perhaps some of the sides of the synagogue walls. And that is where women who were coming to synagogue, coming to services, would be seated up there. Of course, with the dawn of Reform Judaism and ultimately into conservative Judaism as well, where families sit together, men and women sit together, that's not a feature that you will see in modern synagogues. So as the synagogue went through this evolution from very, very nondescript, actually from the earliest stone places to nondescript buildings, to ultimately very, very grand sort of buildings that would be built in Europe, and some very grand synagogues also that we have in the United States of America, that testament to the idea that Jews are equal and Jews can build beautiful houses of worship just as their Christian neighbors can. Now, some interesting little sort of synagogue tidbits that I ran across. The Belt's Great Synagogue. The Belt's Great Synagogue is in Jerusalem. It's a Jerusalem synagogue. And interestingly enough, has only been opened as a synagogue since the year 2000. So it's relatively new synagogue in terms of, the age of synagogues. It is the largest synagogue in the world. There is no synagogue bigger than the Belt's Great Synagogue. Now, it was built by the Belzer's Hasidic community with donations that came in from all around the world. It can seat, if it is completely filled for high holy days or for any other sort of worship function, when the Belgrade synagogue is completely filled, it can hold 10,000 worshipers. 10,000. That's a pretty large synagogue. I mean, imagine being in row whatever, you know, in the synagogue, and you've got 10,000 people, of course, and it is Orthodox. So on the main floor of the synagogue, the primary seating is, of course, for men only. And there is balcony area around the back and the sides for the women who would come for services for the synagogue. I don't know on what sort of occasions that is completely filled to capacity. I would have to guess that for high holy days and other festivals that you could have perhaps a completely filled synagogue of 10,000. I don't know if weekly, I doubt that weekly for services on daily services or Friday or Saturday that you're going to have 10,000, but it is a very, very large synagogue.
Yeah.
So yes, Flossie.
Where is this synagogue located?
It's in Jerusalem.
That's what Jeff said. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
We did not see it when we were there a couple years ago. It's just my personal sort of it's nothing, it's big, but it's nothing that particularly gorgeous to my way of thinking. But you know, everybody's idea of what's beautiful architecture or whatever, I guess, is different. To me, it's just sort of like, oh, okay, yeah, there you go. So anyway, a little interesting that you've got a synagogue that can seat 10,000 people. I mean, I think that's in itself, it's kind of a grand testament to, you know, the building of a major, major house of worship, of course, in Jerusalem. Number 2, we have the Dohany Street Synagogue. Now, I don't know, my Magyar Hungarian is not good, so I don't know that I'm pronouncing that particularly correctly. But the Dohany Street Synagogue was built in the 1850s, so older than the one in Jerusalem, clearly. It is in Budapest. It is also a quite large synagogue. It is considered the largest synagogue in Europe. It can accommodate 3,000 worshipers when it is completely filled for Shabbat or for high holy days or something of that. It can accommodate 3,000 worshipers. It did get severely damaged during World War II. Parts of it were being used as a storehouse during the war for Nazi munitions and things of that sort. Part of it was also being used as a stable for horses, but it was not destroyed to the point that it could not be refurbed and redone after the war. Interestingly enough, if you are familiar with New York City and you are familiar with Central Synagogue in New York City, Central Synagogue in New York City was built as almost an exact replica on a smaller scale to some degree, but an almost exact replica of the Dohany Street Synagogue in Budapest. So that's an interesting sort of tidbit. The other interesting bit of trivia that I found out about the Dohany Street Synagogue in Hungary is that when it was, shortly after it was put into a function as a house of worship, it held a community that were known as Neolog Jews. And this is a term, I'll be honest with you, I was not familiar with, maybe you are. The Neolog Jewish community that was at that time the synagogue community there was sort of a forerunner of Reform Judaism. Reform was just getting started at this time in Germany, had not spread beyond Germany, but there was this community in Budapest that was already in its own way beginning to make some changes in traditional Orthodox synagogue worship. So I found that a sort of fascinating little tidbit. that I did not know that there even was this group of people who were reformers in Jewish worship, reformers in Jewish liturgy, that were sort of getting their changes into the worship service at the same time as reform was becoming more popular in Germany, and of course then as it would cross the ocean into the United States of America. So very, very interesting sort of tidbit there. Yes, Larry.
Yeah, one other interesting thing with the Doheny is that as you look at the wording over the entrance to the synagogue, I don't remember what the wording actually says, but there are a couple of little marks that they have, like little stars that are above certain of the letters there, and there's supposed to be some mystical influence as far as the interpretation of those little stars, that what that means. So apparently they did have a mystical element to them that was at the time a Kabbalah that was part of the heritage of that synagogue. And the other major thing about it that they tell that is that Tony Curtis was very instrumental in there's a garden in the back there, and the garden has got all kinds of ornamental devices, and one of them is a tree of life, so to speak, and they have different kind of leaves that are cut out of metal, and I guess it's based on donations and things like this, just like you would do in a wall or something, but they have it back there, and he was a very big financier, the actor Tony Curtis.
Well, that's interesting because I just read an article this week that Jamie Lee Curtis has just given funding, and I don't know exactly where, but another synagogue that had some connection to Tony Curtis's family. I believe it's in Hungary, and she has donated to also sort of refurb the synagogue and bring it back to its former glory. So it's interesting that you mentioned Tony Curtis, and I just saw this about Jamie Lee Curtis. This was maybe 3 or 4 days ago that I came across this little blurb as I was scrolling through news, and I don't even know what made me stop on it. I mean, I like Jamie Lee Curtis and all that, and I'm reading this article about Jamie Lee Curtis in a synagogue. I'm like, well, that's very cool. This is a very cool connection, from, Hollywood, Jewish Hollywood. We talked about Hollywood a couple of weeks ago. So, when people find connections through family to some of these European houses of worship and to the synagogues, that they still want to see them, restored and brought back to perhaps what they were at one point. So that's just interesting kind of little tidbit. So let's cross the ocean to the United States now, and let's take a minute to talk about Temple Emmanuel. Temple Emmanuel, which is of course in New York City. Perhaps some of you have been there, maybe you've even attended services. Yes, Flossie.
Before we go across the United States, one quick question. This Milog, is that how you say it? Milog?
It's N-E-O, N as in Nancy, E-O-L-O-G.
L-O-G, I see.
Yes.
Okay. What is the time frame of them, please?
Well, the synagogue was constructed during the 1850s, which is also the same time period of really the beginnings of Reform Judaism in Germany. So this was kind of happening at the same time, it seems like. So yeah, we're talking 1850s in Budapest.
Yeah, before you cross the ocean, one other question, Tim, maybe you've found in any of your research. What about music in the synagogue? I mean, there's always been this controversy that, even the temple had music of some sort, but did the synagogues, adopt that? Were you able to find anything at all about?
Yes, most of the synagogues who were of the Orthodox tradition, which many of them were, of course, did not permit any kind of instrumental music, even though we know that music had been part of worship way, way back in Judaism, in the days of Temple Judaism even. It was not always that music was out or banned from the synagogue, but during the period of Orthodoxy, there was no music in the synagogue, no instrumental music. It really would be the Reform movement that would make the change to instrumental music in the synagogue. And I believe these Neolog Jews also, because when I was looking a little bit of background on them, they also believed that music was important as a part of prayer and important for worship. So it's almost like that you had this sort of two groups who were trying to make changes into the traditional worship service at the exact same time, but were unaware perhaps of what the other were doing. Maury, did you have a question? No. Okay. So let's go to the United States. So we have Temple Emmanuel. How many of you have been to Temple Emmanuel in New York City? Anybody? Oh,
Yeah.
I have. Temple Emmanuel.
Walked by.
What?
I've just walked by. I
Oh,
was
walk
just
by. Okay.
being
Well,
in this, a 35 family congregation in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. They have practically as many rabbis as we have members.
True, it's got quite the staff. It's a very, very large congregation. It is the largest Reform synagogue in the world. So Temple Emmanuel in New York City still holds the distinction as the largest Reform synagogue in the entire world. It is a synagogue that is, let's just say, quite Tony, quite well-to-do. I can never remember where it's on the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side. I get that confused all the time. My New York City.
Upper East Side, it's on Fifth Avenue.
Yes,
I just
Fifth
looked it up, 65th.
Okay. Okay, thank you, because I always get that wrong. My brother who lives in New York gets really angry at me that I can't remember the Upper East and the Upper West. It is able to accommodate 2,500 worshipers if it is filled to capacity. Temple Emmanuel means God with us, can accommodate 2,500 worshipers if it is completely filled. It was built in, interestingly enough, just at the dawn of the Great Depression, late 20s, 1929, is when the edifice that we see standing there on the edge of Central Park was built. It's a bit controversial because there are some people, I'm not going to judge this in one way or another, but some people who have been to Shabbat services at Temple Emmanuel feel like they were at St. Michael's Episcopal. Because it is so Reform as to be almost not even Jewish. It's very, very much classical Reform in the strictest way. The rabbis wear these, they did. The last time I looked in on one of their services, which was a little while ago, because they do stream their Shabbat services, they come down the center aisle as sort of a processional, which is not really traditionally a Jewish kind of thing, but they do, and then go on to the Bima. It is a congregation of a lot of very important and influential people. It is where the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Schumer, is a member of Temple Emmanuel. So I guess if you would go there for services, you might be, rubbing elbows or hobnobbing with some of the elites of New York City. All right, still staying in the United States, I think we need to mention Congregation Or Hatzafon. Congregation Or Hatzafon is the most northern synagogue in the world. There is no synagogue further north in the world than Congregation Or Hatzafon. It is in Fairbanks, Alaska. And so it is known to be the most northern synagogue. There is, from what we know of, there may be little groups of Jews more northerly than that, but an actual dedicated synagogue building is Congregation Or Hatzafon in Fairbanks, Alaska. It has 51 families as members. So interestingly enough, that in Fairbanks, Alaska, if you find yourself there on a winter night, you can go to Congregation Or Hatzafon for a Friday night service or a Saturday morning service and worship with them. It's quite an interesting little, if you picture a sort of traditional side-by-side duplex that you might see in a Savannah neighborhood or any neighborhood in a particular city or town, that's kind of what the synagogue looks like. It looks like a side-by-side duplex kind of building. The only thing that really kind of marks it as a synagogue or a Jewish house of worship is there are Stars of David above the door that are pretty clearly visible. But other than that, there's nothing really, but I just found it interesting that, to know that this is the most northern synagogue that we know of. And then we need to take a mention of the Touro Synagogue, which is in Newport, Rhode Island. And some of you perhaps have been to Rhode Island and you've been to Newport, which is, of course, a beautiful, beautiful place. And the Touro Synagogue. It is the oldest Jewish house of worship in North America that is still standing. There were others that have since been demolished, torn down, whatever, but Truro Synagogue, built in 1763, is still standing. It still has an active congregation that worships in its site. It is also a National Historic Site for the reason of being one of the oldest Jewish houses of worship. And right now it counts 175 families or family units, as members at the Truro Synagogue. How many of you have been to Truro? Okay, I have myself, I've seen it as well. Again, not a particularly impressive building, but historically important as kind of setting down roots for a Jewish community in North America, in the United States of America, before we even were the United States of America. It has undergone a controversy in its history. There have been court cases to determine who actually is in charge of Truro Synagogue. There was a congregation in New York City that claimed that they had sort of ownership of it, but a court decision said, no, you don't. It's not yours. It belongs to the people who are in Newport. And it went back and forth. The last I know, it was the Newport community that was granted control of the synagogue over those in New York. But it got kind of ugly and it got kind of messy for a while. But I think at this point, it's kind of worked itself out. So that's just some ideas about the synagogue that I wanted to share with you, history, trivia, whatever, as kind of my farewell, my swan song out of Savannah. My last class, you are my last people. And as I said, there's a sort of bittersweetness. I mean, I have loved working at Mickve Israel. My favorite part has always been the classes, and that's just because it's in my blood to teach. I will miss it, but I have a feeling I'll probably be doing some of it because I've already been asked by some people in Portugal that we've contacted with, like, oh, you can help us to get this off the ground in Portugal. So I will probably continue to do it. I thank all of you who have been around for these classes, who have tuned in for the classes, who have been sort of faithfully, following the different subjects that I've managed to get across to you. I'm not gonna lie, I'm trying real hard not to get a little teary because I tend to do that. I cry at TV commercials, so that tells you something. Or if I see cute pictures of, animals and things, I kind of get that way. It's just me. I've been told I'm very highly emotional, and I guess I am. But I will miss it. I will miss Savannah, and I will miss Mickve Israel, and I will miss the staff that I worked with at Mickve Israel, who, when I came in, were very supportive. You come into a group of people who've already worked together for a while, and you're the new guy and whatever, but I didn't really feel like the new guy for a long period of time, the rabbi and the other staff and whatever. Of course, the greatest story is I arrive at Mickve Israel, I'm getting settled in, and maybe some of you know this story already, and Rabbi Haas comes to me and he goes, we're gonna have a trip to Israel and I'm putting you in charge. And then he turned around and walked away, and I'm like, well, okay. And so it was my duty to make sure that trip that happened 2 summers ago for Mickve Israel, and I had never been a travel sort of host or ranger or travel kind of, but it happened. And I remember sitting at one point and thinking, oh, I did it. I actually did it. But it was kind of a heavy shoulder responsibility to be told on, I think maybe the 2nd or 3rd day that I was there, that, oh, you're gonna plan the whole trip to Israel. And I'm like, okay, Rabbi, thanks.
Tim, you've acquired a bit of a national following, and we're of course talking to you Zoom from 1,000, 1,200 miles away, but you could acquire an international following from Portugal. Zoom works over distances of 3,000 or 4,000 miles, I'm sure.
Oh, it does, because we have Zoomed with people in Portugal.
Well, we will miss you very much, Tim. You have been one of our strongest links to Savannah and have really made us love it as much as we do. I have to say that you have been really instrumental in our loving Savannah. So we will miss
Thank
you.
you.
I wish you the best and I hope for much happiness, but it's kind of bittersweet over here. So
Okay.
Maybe they'll invite me to do a guest, class here and there. And knowing my love of teaching, it would be hard for me to say no.
Tim,
Yes.
you had everybody's addresses, and I don't think it's unreasonable to think that in a month or two, you could contact all of us and just say, we're having a get together, allow for the time difference and say like 5 o'clock and fill us in on what you're doing. I
Sure.
think, it doesn't have to be a class where you have to work and prepare, but I think we'd all love to get a personal update in a month or two and just say, hey, come, and everybody hold up a drink at this end and say, hi, Tim, we'd
And we'll
love
do a
it.
l'chaim together. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I would be more than happy to. I don't intend to disappear. You're not going to get rid of me that easily.
Okay.
I don't intend to disappear into the woodwork. And I am going to make sure that, the staff at Mickve Israel and the rabbi will have a, way to stay in touch with people. And I will maybe send some periodic updates that they can include in the e-news and whatever of what's going on. And of course, if any of you find yourselves in Portugal, you're just walking along a path one day and, oh, I'm in Portugal. How did that happen? You might, we can always stop and, share a bite to eat and a glass of wine or something. And, I'll be happy by that point, hopefully know my way around Porto enough to show you some of the sites and all of that, because it's always good when you're in a new place to connect with familiar faces and all of that. So no, you will hear from me. I intend to, and I would be more than happy to do a Zoom where we can all kind of get together and, I'll tell you the ups and the downs, because I'm not afraid to say, boy, I really messed up. I just, okay, I don't want to offend anybody, but I just found out that in Portuguese, the word kua means cocoa or hot chocolate. So if you want to go into a shop and you want a hot chocolate or a cocoa, you say kua. But if you mispronounce it, because it's C-O-C-O, cocoa, that means poop. So it's all about getting the vowel correct. And I'm sure at some point I'm going to walk into a coffee shop or something and ask for the wrong thing. And it will be a great laugh for the staff of the people working there, I'm sure.
And they'll probably give it to you.
I hope not.
You'll only do it once.
Once, exactly.
Tim, I know I speak for everybody. You're just a great teacher. Your enthusiasm, your preparation, and your just willingness to talk about subjects and to find out about them and dig into them has just been superb. And in a large sense, I think we all envy what you're doing. The fact that it's great adventure that you're going on, and to some sense, we want to live vicariously, maybe through your experience.
I'll be the vicarious.
Spread the word in Portugal. I mean,
right.
Do what you're doing here and make the U.S. look good in Portugal. I'm sure.
Oh yes, I will talk about. I will be telling people about the Portuguese connection between Congregation Mickve Israel and all of that, because it's kind of fascinating that I'm going back to the beginnings of Mickve Israel when I go, and I really kind of find it fascinating that I'm going to where our congregation began. So yeah, definitely. So yeah, I will definitely be in touch. And as I said, I've promised too that I will, have things in the office, and anybody who wants to drop an email and all of that kind of thing. And I would love to have a little get together where we can and I'll let you know what's going on in Portugal and keep you abreast of what's going on in the Jewish community in Porto as well, because it's growing right now. There is a sort of Jewish renaissance happening over there. So, okay, people, for the last time, have a great week. Early Shabbat Shalom. Stay in touch. I will get to Mickve Israel to an email. I don't know how long they're going to keep my Mickve Israel email going, but I will continue to check that. And we aren't leaving the country till the end of July. So if you need anything, or I can be of help to any of you in any way, up until that point, do not hesitate to contact me. Even though I won't be at the office of the synagogue, they can certainly find me. And I think they'll probably keep my email up and running, at least until I leave, I hope anyway. So yes, if any of you, need something, or as I said, I can help you, feel free to contact me, because I'm still going to be here, and I'm more than willing to help anybody out in any way that I can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody. Have a good
Good
evening. All right.
Travels.
Safe travels.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good luck.
Oh.
Thanks.